About 3 weeks ago, Destiny dropped a brand new free update called Into the Light, which brought a bunch of old weapons back and a new horde defensive mode called Onslaught. Since the launch of Into the Light, I've played a bunch of the new game mode, so today, I decided I'm going to explain 5 different loadouts which I think are extremely good and should help you grind out these Legend Wave 50 runs or Wave 10 farms. Just before we get into the loadouts, if you ever need extra help or are looking for more information, feel free to stop by the streams or join my Discord. There you can contact me easier and I can try to personally help you out. Anyways, let's get into the video. Right before we get into the actual loadouts, I want to cover some base information that will help you decide if you want to pick a certain loadout or not. Also, from here on out, I will not be talking about normal Onslaught at all, only Legend. These loadouts can obviously be used in normal, but normal for the most part is pretty easy, so I'm not going to cover it. The first topic we're going to talk about is if you're doing Wave 10 farms or Wave 50 run. If you're doing Wave 10 farms, then the only thing that really matters is that you understand how your loadout works and if you like it. Wave 10 farming is easy for the most part, so run whatever you like the best and get the killing. If you want some quick recommendations for Wave 10 farming, I'm going to recommend running at least one Warlock with Wall of Radiance and one Hunter with Deadfall Orpheus rig. The Warlock can either be Phoenix Protocol or Sunbracers or honestly whatever else they want to run, and then the final person can be a wildcard. You can stack another Tether or Well or go crazy with ad clear like a Consecration Pyrogale Titan. Now for the Wave 50 run. I highly recommend running at least one Phoenix Protocol Warlock and one Deadfall Orpheus rig Hunter. Wall of Radiance is way too good to pass up on, especially when you get into the later waves or you need to tank a hit from a Tormentor early on. Phoenix Protocol will allow for fast well regeneration, and with the combination of a Deadfall Orpheus Hunter, you should be able to get your well back before your current well runs out, and if not, then you'll get it back soon after. The Orpheus Hunter is also extremely important because this will allow us to get our super back extremely fast, and again, in combination with the Phoenix Warlock, we should be able to get our super back before it runs out or shortly after. Also, since almost all the ads run into some sort of funnel on their way to the ADU, the objective, you should be able to stop almost, if not all the ads before they hit it. These two classes are almost essential, although it is possible to do it without them if your team is good enough. Also, for the artifact, there's a ton of great perks we can run this season, so let's go over some of them real quick. We have Kindling Trigger, which when Radiant, will cause solar weapons to scorch unscorched combatants. Flint Striker, which grants Radiant on rapid solar weapon precision hits or rapid solar weapon final blows. Torch, which will give you a damage buff when you're Radiant and are dealing damage to combatants with a Strand or Stasis debuff. Heart of Flame, which grants you a damage buff when casting your solar super nearby allies and gives you a higher buff depending on how many of them are nearby. Wish into Being, which will grant you Orbs of Power on ability final blows just before your super bar hits max to help fill it up. Unraveling Orbs, which will grant Strand Weapons unraveling rounds when you pick up an Orb of Power. Revitalizing Blast, which weakens bosses or champions when you hit them with solar abilities. Raise of Precision, which will allow solar precision kills to cause ignition when you're Radiant. And Argent Ordnance, which consumes an armor charge on shooting a rocket launcher, causing it to do more damage. The most important ones here are Revitalizing Blast, Raise of Precision, and Heart of Flame. There are some other solid perks in the artifact that I didn't end up talking about, but some of these are kind of niche, so make sure you read over them and see if you want to try it out or not. But all the ones that I just mentioned are pretty good, so feel free to mix these in and out. Here's what I like to run. Our first loadout we're going to go over, which is arguably the most important loadout, is our Deadfall Orpheus rig Hunter. Deadfall is unbelievably strong in this game mode, since most of the enemies funnel straight down a corridor into the ADU. This means a well-placed tether will end up heavily slowing down the current push, allowing time for you to regroup and settle down to kill the enemy. One of Deadfall's huge perks is that the ads will share the damage taken from one tethered enemy to the other enemies that are also tethered, which would make killing the whole group super easy. Tethering the enemies also suppresses them, which means they won't shoot back at you. You can even go as far as spawn camping the ads if you're experienced enough and you know the spawns, since it's not like they can do anything to you while they're tethered. Then to make things even better, we're running Orpheus Rig, which would help us get our super back extremely fast by giving us up to 50% of our super on tagging targets with our tether. We don't only get super back though, we also get 10% of our abilities back for each target tethered, which allows us to have a higher ability uptime. While Orpheus Rig doesn't actually give us all of our super back, we have 2 other teammates which will be helping us out big time in orb generating. Like I said earlier, having a Phoenix Protocol Warlock is extremely useful. Not just because of the Well of Radiance spamming, but because they are an orb spawning powerhouse, which will help us get our tether back. Then from there on out, we can spam our tether over and over again. Then once we get the boss damage, all we have to do is slap our tether right in the middle of the room and just do damage. This tether should tag the boss and the ads next to him, plus a bunch of ads will cluster back around to the middle to try to shoot you, which will end up tethering them too, making orb generation huge for you and your teammates. Another great plus is that if you get the boss room challenge where you have to defeat the shielded combatants, this tether will end up hitting the boss, the ads, and the shielded combatants right off rip. Which means as long as you're doing consistent damage, you should be able to kill these shielded guys really fast and get that nice damage buff. Now there is a little bit of a thought process when it comes to building this loadout. The first thing we're going to go over is our aspect. We're going to be running Vanishing Step and Trapper's Ambush, which enables us to go invisible pretty easily. Vanishing Step will allow us to go invisible just off of dodging, and Trapper's Ambush makes it so that our Smoke Grenade allows us and our teammates to go invisible as well. Then for our fragments, we're going to run Echo of Vigilance, which gives us temporary overshield after defeating a target when our shields are depleted, Echo of Remnants, which makes our grenades last longer, Echo of Undermining, which grants our abilities a weaken effect, and Echo of Starvation, which grants us Devour on Void, Breach, or Orb pickup. The only one of these that I super recommend are the Echo Starvation and Echo Remnant, while the other ones can be subbed out if you please. Echo of Obscurity is also super strong because it'll make you invisible off finishers, but I personally didn't utilize finishers enough for it to matter to me. We're also going to be running really any sort of Void weapon, but I personally love Graviton Lance. Graviton Lance is an unbelievably great ad clear weapon, since getting kills with this weapon will cause enemies to detonate and spawn tracking Void projectiles which can chain after each kill. That means these projectiles, when they kill another enemy, will make them spawn more projectiles and over again, making ad clear super easy. Graviton's Catalyst also gives you Vorpal and Turnabout, which are nice benefits, meaning that Vorpal will allow you to do more damage to bosses, and Turnabout will give you Overshield when breaking a combatant's shield. The other weapons can be really whatever you want, but look out for something like a Riptide, which can take care of almost all champions and does pretty solid damage. And then later on, when we move the damage, I swap out my Riptide for the Supremacy Sniper with Rewind Wounds and Kinetic Tremors. For my heavy slot, I swap between a bunch of different weapons, but tend to decide by whatever the current surge is. And then finally, again for damage, I end up swapping to Leviathan's Breath to make easy work of most bosses, not the Briggs. Now let's move on to our next loadout, which is extremely simple, and that's going to be our Phoenix Protocol Warlock. Like I just explained, having access to a Well Lock with Phoenix Protocol on is a lifesaver. First off, you're going to have access to Well of Radiance, which gives you a constant healing and a 25% damage buff, which means you can for the most part stand in your super safely and rack up ad kills, making defending the ADU easier. Phoenix Protocol is going to give up to 50% of your super back from either you or your allies sitting in your well and getting kills, which means you're going to be able to get your super back super fast as long as you and your allies are generating orbs. So we're back to the Deadfall Hunter that we were just talking about. And again, for the boss room, you can pretty much infinitely well as long as you have another teammate generating orbs constantly. Having the ability to constantly well means you should be able to breeze through the early round, but once you get to those later boss waves like 40 and 50, you need to watch your health, since if those ads are clustered up and decide to hit you at the same time, you can still die in the well. Again, Orpheus Hunters can help you a ton here. For the most part, this loadout can run whatever you want, but there are some things I am going to recommend. First thing is running Touch of Flame, which will enhance our grenade. Whenever you're running healing grenades to grant you restoration times 2, or fusion grenades, which will explode twice and give you extra damage, Touch of Flame will most definitely help you during this run. The other aspect is up to you, but personally, I'm going to pick Icarus Dash for the mobility. Heat Rises is a great option too, but I really only like using it for Sunbracer's build, which you'll end up seeing later. For fragments, we're going to be running Ember of Empyrean to extend our restoration and radiant buffs by getting kills with our solar weapons or ability, Ember of Torches to make us and our teammates radiant by hitting something with our powered melee, Ember of Ashes, which applies more scorch to targets, and the last slot is really up to you, but I'm going to be running Ember of Singeing to get my class ability back faster after applying Scorch. You could also sub out the last 2 slots for Ember of Mercy and Ember of Searing, so you can lean more into a healing build, but we should have plenty of survivability already with the amount of super users we have as a team. For weapons, feel free to run whatever you want as long as you have a solar weapon on. This can either be a primary weapon or a heavy weapon like Fixed Odd, but you need to make sure you're running at least one of these so you can make use of your Ember of Empyrean fragment. Sunshot is a phenomenal pick here, but does take up an exotic slot, so watch out for that. But Riptide is still a great option since it can stun almost all champions. And then for the final slot, I'm personally going to be running Fixed Odds, but you could also run Leviathan's Breath, which is going to be really good for boss damage, killing Tormentors, and taking down champions. Overall, there's not too much to think about with this build, since it's mainly meant for just getting your well back super fast, and the most you have to do is just think about if you should well or not, and if you're going to get good value out of it. Our next loadout is another great build for our Warlock, and that's going to be a Sunbracer's build. Now I know you might be annoyed that there's 2 Solar Warlock builds on this list, but trust me, it's for a good reason. When I was making this decision, I had 2 other classes to think about. Do I showcase Stasis Warlock with Osmiomancies, Arc Warlock with Crown of Tempest or Falling Sunstar, or do I do a Solar Sunbracer's build? And during my last couple weeks of playing and seeing what other people run and think and watching some other videos, I ended up landing on Solar Sunbracer. I know it isn't the coolest build, but really, you're doing anything to get those sweet shiny rolls, am I right? For our super, we're probably going to end up running Well of Radiant, but you can also run Dawnblade if you really want, although I don't recommend it. Now if we're actually using our Sunbracers, we're going to make sure that we have the Touch of Flame aspect on so our solar grenades have a greater effect, spitting out blobs of lava around the grenade. And Heat Rises, which will allow us to hover in the air and fire our weapons to throw a grenade. But most importantly, every kill that we get up in the air will give us a minimum of 20% of our melee energy back, which increases with the tier of enemy we kill up to 50% if it's a boss. Kills while airborne also increases the Heat Rises timer, meaning our uptime can be almost infinite. Having the ability to regain our melee energy so easily will allow us to keep proccing our Sunbracers over and over again, and if you're experienced enough, you can completely spawn trap the enemies. All we're going to do to start our Sunbracers is hold our grenade button to start the Heat Rises, walk up to an enemy that we think we can kill with our powered melee, kill them, then we can start flinging grenades around like crazy. Now you'll want to do this while airborne to make sure that we're getting our melee back super fast, so we can keep doing this over and over again. It's a pretty simple cycle of gameplay, but if you mess something up and don't have one of your abilities, or you don't have heat rises ready, then you could end up with no benefits for a while. For our fragments, we're going to be running Ember of Empyrean to extend our restoration and radiant buffs by getting killed with our solar weapons or abilities, which should be happening a ton here with Sunbracers. Ember of Resolve to cure us after grenade kills, Ember of Ashes to apply more scorch stacks, and again the last slot is up to you, but I'm going to end up running Ember of Singeing to get our class ability back faster after scorching target. I personally run Phoenix Dive, which will give you restoration ×2 when you have heat rises active, and I want my class ability back fast just in case something goes wrong. For the most part, you can run whatever you want here fragment-wise, but I would recommend at least having Ember of Empyrean on and Ember of Ashes. Then for weapons, again it's pretty much up to you, but make sure you throw on a solar weapon to keep Ember of Empyrean up, and then something else to take care of champions. I personally like to run Riptide, Xylole's Bane, and Dragon's Breath. Now it's time to finally move off of our Warlocks and onto our final class, which is also the best class of all time, Titan. For our first Titan build, we're going to be running either a Strand Wormgods or Synthoceps build, depending on which one you like more. The only difference between the two is that Wormgods gives a higher damage buff when you pass the 3rd bar for its charge, and that it doesn't affect super damage, while Synthoceps will buff your melee and super when surrounded. Wormgods is better if you can keep the buff up by killing adds, while Synthoceps keeps the same consistent damage while being easier to proc. I'm going to run Wormgods since keeping the buff up at max stacks is super easy, and it does a good amount of more damage than Synthoceps. But Synthoceps will have a nicer average to work with. We're going to take a different route compared to our last loadouts and talk about weapons first, because there's a little more to talk about here. You've got your normal Strand loadout, where you'll run a 1-2 punch shotgun and melee your way to victory, while using your primary weapon to shoot from afar, and your heavy weapon either for ad clear or boss damage. Or, you can run a loadout that's also centered around meleeing, but this time with a glaive, and then having a 1-2 punch shotgun for chunky enemies. Now yes, I know, glaives don't sound super exciting to use, and they're usually pretty situational, but trust me, there is some actual merit here, especially when you're using Winter Bite. Winter Bite can shoot out a projectile that targets nearby enemies and freezes them. This projectile does pretty solid damage, but a huge selling point of actually using the primary fire on Winter Bite is that it's freezing enemies during its path to whatever it's going to hit, doing good ad clear and decent damage. The projectile isn't the main thing we're going to be using this for though. The melee of the actual glaive is way stronger since we're going to be using Wormgods or Synthoceps. When meleeing with Winter Bite, as long as you have the ammo, you'll end up applying a slow status to enemies, which will stun overloads, and when you hit them enough, they'll freeze, which will stun unstop. This only works when you have ammo stored in the gun though, so make sure you have at least one shot. Now a great tip to be using when you're using Winter Bite is to make sure that when you're meleeing, you're holding down whenever your aim down sight button is. Doing so will allow you to swing faster than you normally would when you're not aiming down sights. Pretty sure this is a bug, but using this will allow you to get off way more melees than if you didn't. Now deciding between if you want to use a glaive or not depends on how far into the rounds you are. Waves 1 to 30, I think Winter Bite will do fine as long as you have Woven Mail and Banner of War up, and you're not playing like a complete maniac. But once you beat that 3rd boss, or even the 2nd boss, you should probably be swapping off the glaive build and playing something like Tractor Cannon, Galahorn, or Dragon's Breath. After that 3rd boss, you have way too high of a chance of dying unless you're super experienced with Strand and how to play around the enemy types you're facing. You can use this loadout up to wave 50, but I'd rather just stick to a normal 1-2 punch build from after wave 30 so that you can quickly take care of those chunky enemies while using your normal weapons or grapple melee for the smaller adds. Speaking of boss damage, when using Strand, you should be fine for the 1st and 2nd boss depending on what they are. But once you get to the later bosses, you should either swap off to a different loadout and do range damage, or commit to getting off a bunch of fast burst damage and dying. You can always end up respawning, so that's the only reason I'd say go and sacrifice yourself for big damage. If your teammates die, then, you know, you won't be able to respawn. So now that we went over that, let's talk about our aspects. We're going to be running into the fray so that we can get Woven Mail off by destroying tangles or popping our super. And then we're going to be running Banner of War, which will grant us a melee damage boost and healing pulses after getting a sword, melee, or finisher kill. Depending on how many kills you're getting while using Banner of War, you'll end up extending the Banner of War buff and upping the stacks of it to 2x, then 3x, then eventually 4x. The more stacks you get will increase the frequency at which you get the healing pulses, which is super important in the harder waves. Then onto our fragment. We're going to be running Thread of Warding, which will give us Woven Mail on orb pickup, Thread of Fury, which grants melee energy on damaging targets with a tangle, Thread of Generation, which gives you grenade energy after dealing any sort of damage, and then the last slot is up to you. I know we just went over weapons, but just to recap, we should be running a 1-2 punch shotgun to help take care of the big chunky enemies, whatever kind of primary you want, and then you're either running Winter Bite for the first 30 waves and swapping off, or you can run something like Tractor Cannon to help make killing enemies easier. Now for a final loadout, which I think is by far the most fun loadout here, and it's a Consecration Pyrogale Titan build. If any of you have watched my Solo Flawless Prophecy guide for Titans, you might be thinking how ironic this is, because in that video, I stated that Consecration is useless. Although I didn't literally mean that, now that I've had the sandbox environment to actually try it out in, I've been having a blast using it. For our Consecration build, we're going to be focusing around getting our melee back and ability spam. Consecration is a Solar Titan aspect that activates when you slide and use your powered melee charge, making your character jump up into the air and then slam right back down to the ground, sending a shockwave of flames forward. Consecration by itself is pretty alright, but once you combine it with Pyrogale gauntlets, you'll end up seeing a whole nother level of usability. Pyrogale gauntlets will enhance our Burning Maul super by allowing us to output one big slam, which will summon 3 big flame tornadoes that track and cause constant scorching and ignitions, putting its damage capabilities as one of the top in the game. Pyrogale also enhances our Consecration melee ability by making the singular flame path split into 3, also summoning 1 flame tornado similar to the super variant. The gameplay loop here is super simple. All we need to focus on doing is using our Consecration melee whenever the group of enemies gather up. You can do this by either letting them funnel down a lane, or you can attempt to spawn trap them. Just make sure that when you're trying to spawn trap, you watch out and make sure it's not a Cursed Thrall round or an Exploding Shank round, as you'll just end up instantly dying. Then once you're done using your melee, our mods that are on screen right now will give us a good chunk of our melee back, allowing us to use them back to back. Then for the boss room, we're going to start off by popping our super, slamming it near enough to the boss where the flames will auto-target them, then we can retreat backwards into the well to do ranged damage. You can then also use your melee for ad clear, or if you're comfortable enough, you can try to use it for boss damage too. Although again, in the later rounds, you're not going to have this sort of leniency. For our aspects, we're obviously going to be running Consecration, which allows us to do the melee combo, and then we're going to throw on Soul Invictus, which will create sunspots on ability final blows, enemy kills when they're scorched, or super kills. Also, walking into a sunspot will allow us to regenerate our abilities faster, and makes our super last longer, although the part including our super doesn't really matter since Pyrogale makes it a one-time use. And we're going to gain Restoration ×1 from walking through a sunspot. And then for our fragments, we're going to be running Ember of Empyrean to extend our Restoration and Radiant buffs by getting kills with our solar weapons or abilities. Ember of Torches to make us and our teammates radiant by hitting something with our powered melee. Ember of Eruption, which will make our ignitions have a greater effect radius. And Ember of Ashes, which will apply more scorch stacks to targets. This combination of fragments is going to allow us to keep our Radiant and Restoration up, since we're going to be killing a ton of enemies with our solar abilities. And then at the same time, we're going to be buffing how fast we apply Scorch and how effective our ignitions are. You can sub out Ember of Eruption and Ember of Ashes if you want to, but I think it flows pretty well here. Then finally we have our weapons. For weapons, I'm going to recommend running something like Galahorn or Dragon's Breath, since they're both great ad clear weapons and are solar, which will synergize greatly with our whole setup. Dragon's Breath is going to be my go-to here, since Dragon's Breath has a form of auto-loading and does great damage overall, which means you can actually use it for damage phase. Galahorn is great for damage phase too, but requires your teammates to run rockets to actually get the full benefits out of it. Besides that, Galahorn is super good for ad clear, and so is Dragon's Breath. Our other weapons are going to consist of, again, anything to stun champions, and a solar weapon to make sure we can keep our buffs up from range. You could probably be fine with skipping out on running a solar primary weapon, since we're just going to end up using our melee ability most of the time, but it's always nice to have something on standby. And I think that's about it. Hopefully you guys like these loadouts, and let me know which one you end up liking the best, and if you were successful on your wave 50 clears or not. And if you aren't running wave 50, and are just wave 10 farming, leave a comment below of your best roll you've gotten so far. Just a reminder, if you ever need any help, you can always stop by the streams and or join my Discord where I can talk directly to you guys. The streams are slowing down a little bit since I'm back in school and midterms for this week, but that's why the Discord exists. I'm very active in the Discord as long as there are people who need help or who are just hanging around and just want to talk. If you've ever considered it, I do have a members program if you feel like joining that. It's just for supporting the channel and you don't get any sort of real benefits. You'll get some badges for the live streams, a cool Discord role, and maybe early access to videos if I post them early enough. Just remember this is a subscription-based model, so please cancel whenever you're done. Alright, well that's it guys. Thanks for watching, and hopefully, I'll see you around.